Hi, everybody. I'm Heather Schwarz from Knowable World. Today, I'm here talking with my friend Vijay Krishnamoorthy, and we're going to talk about his experience with Scott Powell's book, The History of Now, and the theory of present centrism that's presented in that book. So, Vijay, you've been a student of Scott's for how long now? A few years?
Yeah, couple of years. So I found Scott. I had moved to Canada, and it was during the pandemic. I just started homeschooling my son, and I was kind of looking for a framework to teach my son history. I didn't have any idea how to go about doing it, and that's how I found Scott online. And I started with his elementary school recordings for my son, and I used to do the recordings along with my son. So that's how I started with Scott's work, actually.
Yeah. Well, that's not how I started, but I definitely did the elementary level recordings with my kids, 1 or 2 years, and it's great. You learn so much. I
Yeah,
did.
I learned quite a bit, and I kind of liked it that I started with the elementary level because it starts from the ground up. And the first 2 years, I did his elementary recordings with my son, and a little bit of the junior high recordings as well, because that came as part of like when you paid for it, you got that as well. That's what I started with. And then he announced, he had these mini lessons that he announced. And at that point, I was already like I viewed him as like the history teacher I wish I had in school. So when he announced that he's going to do live classes, I got into that, and it's just around that time that I also read History of Now, um, around I would say 2022, thereabouts.
Okay, great. So you read them before you started doing classes with him, and you read them.
Yeah, yeah,
Great.
because because the classes were he started with Russia, but then I kind of felt that if I was doing the classes, it would be better if I had read the book because
Right.
I knew a little bit about the book. I had already bought it on Kindle, but I hadn't read it. So I kind of went through the whole book really quickly before starting his live lessons on like he did Russia and China, and he had a couple of mini lessons that he did. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember those short courses. So when you first read the History of Now, was that the first time that you had heard of this idea of present centrism in history, or is that something that you were familiar with from the classes? Or, I mean, it's not really explained to the students, to the children, so maybe the book was the first time that you.
Yeah, so the thing is, I've been so immersed in like the history while I was doing it that I don't remember when I encountered the term present centrism. I think it would have been when I read the book that as a word, present centrism. Um, but his method was something that I was actually observing while during the elementary classes with my son. So in that sense, I've encountered present centrism before, even though the word I would say it was much later it was only while reading the book.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. And so did maybe at that point it didn't feel like a new idea to you, but did it
Um,
seem like a contrast to the way you learned history before?
yeah, so because I did the elementary class, I think because of that, my understanding was very tempered by doing the classes. So I first thought when I did the classes, I knew it was unique, like just going in, because obviously I was relating it to the way I had learned history. And I observed that Scott was starting with the present, that he was like every segment of history that he did, he would start with the present. And I first thought it was kind of like a didactic or like a pedagogical tool that he was using, that it was more to motivate the students to kind of go back into history. It's an explanation of the present. And I thought that was what he was doing. But once I read the book, I realized that it was much more. And then as I did the classes, I realized that it was much more than what I initially thought it was, even though I thought it was new, because it's not just new, it's very unique, and it completely changes. the way you would look at history or at the world once you kind of completely understand what he's trying to do.
Mhm. Yeah, so how would you say that it did change the way that you thought about history after learning that?
Uh, so, so for one, history is always viewed as a study of the past, and I've also just thought of that as like as the study of the past. And when I did history in school, like if there were events in history that I was studying which was closer to the present, that I would find more interesting generally. And I didn't realize that the relevance was that it was closer to the present. I could connect it in some way implicitly.
Right.
But but I always viewed history as a study of the past, and it is mostly irrelevant stuff, really boring things, like depending on which culture you are growing up in, and you get different versions of history, and then like, why are we even looking at this? It was something that in school mostly was something that I was forced to do, than something that I really think was thought was relevant or of any use to me. That completely changes once you engage with Scott's work. It's you realize how important it is and how much of a better understanding of the world you can gain by learning history. And um, it's difficult to completely kind of, like within the space of one, you could write an essay on this. You could write a lot on just this question that you asked. But I want to maybe give some essential points. So one of the things that Scott does in his work is um, he says that one of the tasks of the historian, and this is very unique to Scott's work, no other historian says this or thinks like this. He says that one of the tasks is to give you an organized awareness of the present. And having an organized awareness of the present, the first thing it does is it contextualizes your learning of history, makes it more relevant. You kind of understand what you're trying to explain. And
Right.
so, and it makes it much easier to retain history. It makes it much more interesting. And because of all this, you actually remember a lot of it. Like, it would have been your experience as well, right? That you learn so many things and like dates and events and names, and then you just have some general sense of, hey, something happened and that's it. But that's not the way Scott's work is. It's actually you end up using it in your daily kind of thinking, and that's the other thing. Like if you read things in the news, you immediately connect it back to something you've learned in history. And it's not just connected back like a single event, you actually see it as a sequence or a progression. And
You
yeah,
have that of course moment, even though it's new, and even though you couldn't have, guessed that something would happen, it's, "Oh, okay. That makes sense that that would happen next." And it's this, like, sense of understanding, that's how I feel about it anyway, that
and and I've had this experience where maybe I'm like encountering something like an event which I've already kind of read about earlier, but this time around when I read it, I'm like, oh, this is the way, this is the reason that it's like this. Like the same thing, you encounter it again, and you have a different way in which you're looking at it. So yeah, definitely.
for sure. Um, okay, so let's talk about how how and we just touched on it a little bit, but like how knowing present centrism or thinking about history present centrically. So Scott has a phrase that he uses to define history. He says history is the revelation and explanation of the world that we live in. So in contrast to it just being about events from the past, which which is an impossible proposition. If it's just events from the past, then it could be any event from the past. So how do you differentiate, or how do you understand what's more important and what isn't? Um, versus thinking about it as the explanation and revelation of the world that we live in present centrically. So when you come across some new idea, either from history or something in the news that touches on some, you know, world event or whatever, How do you process that differently now that you've got the present-centric framework than you would have before?
Um, so one of the things I used to do um, when I encounter some events in the world was um, I would try to relate to it with whatever philosophical knowledge I have, in the sense of I already have some ideas about, say, ethics or politics or economics, and these are things that I already know about because I read widely. I try to approach it from that kind of perspective, and it definitely gives me a half decent understanding of the event that's taking place. But it's still an isolated fact that I'm not relating to history. And relating it to history is the only way you can actually completely contextualize and integrate events that are happening in the world, like historic events at the scale of the world, and even if it's at the scale of your own culture that you're living in. I think a view of history, an integrated view of history, can give you a better understanding. I'll give you an example. For example, like if you take, say, 9/11, for example, and like the subsequent war on terror, I know to some degree about, say, the kind of ideas that are motivating those events. From, okay, there are people who actually want to, they look at Islam a certain way and they want to engage in terrorism, and then they've attacked the US, and then the US is doing something in response to that. Whether it's right or wrong, those are like, that doesn't matter. To In terms of my understanding, I'm only looking at that.
Right.
And maybe if I look back, I might look back as far as, say, um, the US engagement in the Middle East. But I'm not completely contextualizing it unless I think of what the US foreign policy has been in general, how it has changed over a period of time, and how those changes are affecting the world we live in. And I'm not able to contextualize it completely if I don't understand Islamic history, how they were triumphal culture before this and how they have engaged with the West. And then the West before America being the cardinal culture, which is a term that Scott uses. Um, I won't understand it unless I see also the way Europe has engaged with the Islamic culture.
Mhm.
And then you also won't understand America's intervention in the Middle East unless you contextualized how their relationship with Russia kind of determined that whole sequence.
Right. Yeah.
And then you have to understand where Russia comes from. You have to go back and see their history and their relationship with Europe. And then once you start doing this, you realize that to actually like really integrate that understanding, you need an understanding of all the cardinal cultures in the world
Yeah.
throughout history. And what I said is just like a sequence with one event. You could do that with a lot of the world events. I mean, we did Russian history when at the time it was very interesting because the Ukraine war had just started. And irrespective of what you think about the actions of the cultures in the event, just to understand why it's happening, you need to go back in history. Uh, so that's
And it
that's
sounds like an overwhelming and impossible task if all you're thinking about is that history is everything that has ever happened in the past. Then it feels like I need to know everything and I can't, so I can never understand. But I think that's exactly what Scott does differently, is that he gives you that organized awareness where you don't need to know every single thing that's happened in the past because you have a framework and you have this organized way of looking at it, and you can understand the most important events and how those fit together. And like you just described, what did you describe, five or six cultural blocks or major cultures, and how those interact, and the important events in world history is those same blocks interacting over and over again. So
yeah,
it's not everything.
yeah. And so I'm someone who's like terrible with dates. And Scott's one of those few historians who will tell you that the dates are important, but it's not necessary to remember every date.
Right.
And he also, so for example, we spoke about the organized awareness of the present that he works with, right? So one thing he does is he uses that to kind of cut out all the relevant things that from history that you don't need to learn. And this is, I mean, it's so useful that because you don't have to learn large swaths of history which are not relevant. So he cuts out, it's like a cognitive razor that he uses, and then he cuts out a lot of the history and he teaches whatever is relevant for you today now. And that makes it much easier, and it gives you the broad framework within which you can actually learn more history in depth as you move forward, depending on your interest and your purpose with dealing with it. But the way he's teaching history, it's history for anyone. Like anyone living in the world today would benefit from learning Scott's history. It's not to a specific segment or to a particular person, but like it's for anyone. So, and that is, it's because it's an essentialized history, and it's a very different way of looking at history. He makes it accessible to everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree. And okay, so we have a few minutes left, and I just want to swing that a little bit to talking about our kids, because both of us have children who are students of Scots, and
Yes.
we have seen the difference not only for ourselves in learning history, but see how it's different for them starting at a very early age and learning history this way. And so one thing that I've heard somebody say about the idea of doing history in a present centric way is that it's almost too narrow because you're only talking about what's happening in the world right now, and there's so much that you miss out on. But that has definitely not been my experience, or my kids experience, because as they're going through these years of school, the world is changing around them, and they're almost watching it unfold and understanding it as it unfolds. And like you said about Russia, when the Russia-Ukraine war happened, Scott started a class about that for adults, where immediately we could see this change in the world and we could start to understand, why it's happening and what led up to it. Um, and yeah, so that's been my experience with my kids too, is that they are seeing the world around them unfold, and it's giving them such a deep and rich knowledge of history and things that they remember. They remember dates. My
Oh
kids
yeah, of
remember
course,
dates.
of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I have a disdain for dates because of the way history was taught to me, which is to swallow a lot of dates and regurgitate it on paper. So I think I have an aversion to it. So unless, and now I actually like I want to do the work that's required to actually remember some of those dates because they're very relevant. And you also need to remember like the kind of sequence. So in you like knowing the dates are it's very useful that in that sense. But going back to what you were saying about the kids, I cannot tell you how different it is, not just for me, like in what I learned, but what I could see was being taught in schools here or back in India where I'm from, how different it is. And um, in the sense of, so my son doesn't have the sense that history is boring. He doesn't like if you say that, he won't understand what you're talking about because he has no sense of that. And that I think that's an achievement on its own, because most people think of history as boring. Most students think of school as boring, but like history especially, it would be the one that would take the prize for amongst the subjects if you could name one. And my son doesn't have that sense at all. The other thing is, when you spoke about, that what Scott gives is just, he gives very little. He's not giving the everything in history. I think like if I could use a metaphor here, it is like saying that you should learn to swim in the ocean,
Right.
because before you can swim in the ocean, you need to learn in a pool or in some safer space before you can do that. And it's also that you needn't be confronted with all the overwhelming things that are out there. You need to understand the essential steps of learning something, and have a framework for being confident enough to go into that ocean. And today, like we have this situation where most adults are afraid of history, and they're afraid of the way the world, things that are happening, and it's because they don't have a historical framework. I'm not saying you will stop worrying about what's happening in the world, but with knowledge and being historically minded, at least you have the awareness. It's not a blind kind of fear that you have. And that's something that our kids need going into the kind of like the future that is unfolding. They need to know, it's like it's the difference between going walking in the dark and having a torch
Yeah.
that kind of guides you. So um, it's indispensable. Um, And I think the way Scott teaches it, it is interesting even for someone who's really young. Like
Yeah.
because mostly like even if there are people, historians, they if they could think of an age where you could start children on history, they would mostly think of like an older kid who would actually be interested in it. But the
Mhm.
way Scott teaches, it would be interesting and it would be relevant to a much younger child.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, at Knowable World, we're building lessons for 4 and 5-year-olds, and it's based
yeah,
on this. And
yeah,
yeah, it
and
is possible to start to help them see really relevant things from history, even at that young age. Yeah, I really like that metaphor about the swimming pool and teaching them to swim, which is basically to have that framework of a set of dates and a set of sequences and looking at the world as a set of cultures or a set of blocks that act in certain ways. That's really useful. All right. Well, we're gonna wrap up here. Anything that you want to say right at the end to anyone who might be thinking about taking the History of Now class?
yeah, I would say that I think we've covered most of the things that I would have wanted to say to someone. Um, but if I could just say one thing, it's that Scott makes history very interesting and it's a lot of fun,
Yeah,
even though it's history is human beings doing a lot of awful things to each other. You can think of it like there are dark times in history, but you can think of it that you are viewing history, but with the help of a powerful guide. And it's something that you should learn because it benefits you in immense ways.
absolutely. Okay. All right. Thank you, Vijay. And thanks for watching, everybody.
It was a
Bye.
pleasure. Thanks.